Awaken!
So I was stuck on what Archie Comics character to do next, and I received a couple of requests,
To do Cheryl.
Hello, my name is Lucy, and this character essay is part of a series of character essays on the Archie Comics characters and how them and their relationships with others should be portrayed in Riverdale that would help dimensionalize them better while staying truer to the comics. Today's subject is Cheryl Blossom. And this, I feel like, is going to be an interesting one because Cheryl has a very different upbringing in the comics than all of the other characters, or townies, as she likes to call them. Cheryl Blossom was first introduced in 1982 in the 320th Betty and Veronica issue as a third love interest for Archie Andrews. However, she and her twin brother Jason disappeared 2 years later, part of the reason being that she was deemed too sexual for a children's comic. In the 1980s, when a number of alternate universe series were published, Cheryl was a minor recurring character in a short-lived title, Archie's Explorers of the Unknown. She appeared as Blaze Blossom rather than Cheryl, and would brief the explorers on their missions. Her character was reintroduced in the main continuity and back into Archie Andrews' life during the iconic 4-part series entitled Love Showdown in 1994. During the series, Archie receives a letter from Cheryl which states she'll be returning to Riverdale. Archie, infatuated with girls as always, decides to keep Cheryl's return a secret from Betty and Veronica. Cheryl returns to Riverdale, leaving readers wondering who Archie will choose in the end. Cheryl is portrayed as an attractive girl with bright red hair. She comes from a wealthy background and uses her privileged lifestyle and charms to pry Archie away from Betty and Veronica. She is not above using dirty tactics to attract boys in Riverdale, or any other town for that matter. Cheryl lives in Pembroke, an upper-class neighborhood that looks down on the townies of Riverdale High, which is the cruel nickname that she calls the people from Riverdale. This feud between the two towns of Pembroke and Riverdale further fuels the recurring battle between Cheryl and Veronica. Cheryl has appeared in several comic book series over the years, including her own series. Cheryl behaves in a way that reflects her wealth and upbringing. She's very proud of her wealth and squabbles with Veronica over who leads the more extravagant lifestyle. She can be selfish and manipulative, sometimes plotting to lure Archie away from Betty and Veronica. There are stories where Cheryl is rude and condescending to Riverdale townies, and sometimes only appearing as an antagonist to Betty and Veronica. In stories featuring Betty, Veronica, and Cheryl, Cheryl is usually the most adventurous. Cheryl is popular within her Pembroke crowd and popular with the boys in Riverdale, but loathed by the girls for her flirtatious nature, her manipulations, and her attractiveness. Now, this one is very difficult to analyze because Cheryl's job, the purpose that she serves in the comic books, is to be a one-dimensional antagonist most of the time. And in the show, they make her a lot more than that. The way they went about making her more than that is showing maybe the reasons why she is the way that she is, her very toxic family dynamic, her losing her brother. Cheryl undoubtedly goes through a lot in Riverdale's run, and in the first few seasons, it would make sense for her to be, for lack of a better term, a bitch. But now at this point in the show, when she is confirmed to be happy with Tony and with Nana Rose, she still acts the same way. She still treats people very badly, she causes chaos wherever she goes, and she gets into other people's business without any good reason. Which brings me to the main point, is that if you're making an Archie Comics show and you are going to integrate Cheryl into your show, you probably will find yourself having to choose between dimensionalizing Cheryl and giving her a backstory and a full character arc and staying true to the comics. You can't have both. So that said, I have two options for how Cheryl should be portrayed in this show. The first one would be if the show followed the comics more closely. Now, since she has a recurring role in the comics, she should have a recurring role in the show, not a main one. So she would just be a recurring antagonist to Archie and friends. This could have a lot of potential of making her a more likable character than she is now. She would still do horrible things and say horrible things, but the viewer would not be meant to sympathize with her or particularly like her as a person. Rather, they would be just entertained by her and love to hate her. This would make a lot of sense because this is exactly who she is in the context of the comics. I never hated Cheryl while growing up reading these comics because I understood the role that she played. I understood that she was supposed to be kind of an antagonizing, mean girl who was always trying to steal Archie away from Betty and Veronica. I understood that she wasn't friends with these people, that she wasn't supposed to be part of the main storyline, and that she's rather not in it all the time. For those reasons, in the comics, she's not an insufferable character. She's entertaining. There can absolutely be too much of a good thing, and I think that Cheryl's character is a good example of that. She's not in the story all the time because she's not supposed to be. In the comics, her character came and went a lot into the main storyline. And whenever she would come back and make her return, readers would get excited. They would get excited and, say, oh my gosh, Cheryl's back, what's gonna happen? Because they know that she's gonna cause some drama. But if she was in the comics all the time, that excitement and that spark would be completely gone. And admittedly, her character would be way too much. It would just get annoying. And that's kind of how it's always been in the show, because they decided to make a minor recurring character in the comics a part of the main cast in this show. And as a result, she is insufferable. There are main characters and there are recurring characters. Both are needed and both are likable if they fulfill the job that they have in their said media. And to change a recurring character into a main one disrupts that system, and it's a dangerous thing to do. I'm going to give you another example. Do you think that if Janice was in every episode of Friends, you would still like her? Do you think if Todd Packer was in more episodes of The Office that you would think he was as funny as him just being in a few episodes? No. It'd probably make your head explode. With Janice and Packer both being such crazy characters in their respective shows, them being in those shows all the time would have been way too much. And this is kind of what Cheryl is in Riverdale. So the first option of how Cheryl should instead be portrayed in this show is that of her being a recurring character who's not part of the main cast and who frankly does not like the main cast and often gets in disputes with them, particularly with Veronica. But now we're going to talk about the second option for Cheryl's character, which veers away from how she is in the comics a little bit more. And that is, of course, if she does have a main role, she should be more likable. She should definitely still start out as a deranged, horrible person, but in time, she should learn some lessons for those awful things that she does. I'm gonna roll a clip from one of my previous videos talking about Cheryl's lack of a character arc at this point in the show that I think really applies to what I'm trying to say right now. Now, in seasons 1 and 2, I actually liked Cheryl. I liked that she was deranged. I liked that she treated people badly because people treated her badly. But in seasons 3 and 4, she has literally not changed. She still does all these horrible things, calls people names, invades people's privacy, gets into other people's business, takes a picture of Betty and Archie and sends it to the whole school. It's not even her place to do that. Now, in season 1 or the beginning of season 2, this might have made a little bit more sense. She still had a lot of growth to do. But even after she is confirmed to be happy with Tony, the babies, and Nana Rose, she still acts the same way. She still treats people badly, and she still acts like she's better than everybody else.
Your name may be Honey, but I will always be the queen bee. You have no power over me. Look, I'm not sure what Honey has told you, but we don't need a coach. I run the show around here. Howevs, we are looking for a launderwoman. Speak! Beans. So you caved and betrayed me? Who shucketh off the imposter Appleyard?
Listen up, bitches!
Appleyard is indisposed, so consider this a coup.
And before any of you reptiles object, a word to the wise. You owe me this. I've been your fellow vixen and HBIC for 4 grueling years.
Yeah, so her lack of improvement as a person thus far has just been really, really disheartening and almost problematic. It could have worked that in the first 2 seasons she would be acting horrible to everybody, like she's better than everybody else, and just trying to make everybody else's lives miserable because hers is very miserable and that's all she really knows. She would be struggling with things like a toxic family dynamic, a recently deceased brother, internalized homophobia. But after all of that is resolved and she comes through and rises above all of it, she would actually become a better person after that. I think she would still have some of that like sass and fire that Cheryl Blossom has always had, but she definitely wouldn't deliberately do cruel things, at least not nearly as often anymore. So having an outrageously annoying character who defies everybody else and thinks that she's above everybody else, having a character like that in the main cast with the core group of people that you're supposed to root for is problematic and it shouldn't have been done. So that's why the writers and the creators screwed up by not picking one or the other, because you can't have both. Now, I know I mentioned this in my Veronica video, and I have to mention it here because I made it very clear in my Veronica video that I think Veronica should be the one to have the red palette, not Cheryl. Yes, I said it. I don't think Cheryl should have the red palette in this show. I explained why Veronica should have the red palette instead in my Veronica video. If you haven't seen that, I'll link it right up there. But for Cheryl, rather, I think she should dress in greens, yellows, turquoises, and whites. I think that these colors would make her red hair and lipstick really pop. These colors could also generate a lot of pretty and fun floral patterns, which I think she should also wear. Now, a fun part of her character is that, of course, her name is supposed to sound like Cherry Blossom. But if you've read the comics, you will know that Cheryl owns the Blossom part of her name a lot more than she owns the Cherry part, because the Cherry part is already evident in her hair. Cheryl is never obsessed with the color red in the comics like she is in the show. In the comics, she's actually seen to, at times, be obsessed with flowers. I remember one issue where Betty and Veronica go to Cheryl's house and Cheryl takes them into this room. This room in her mansion is just filled with flowers that all of her admirers have given her. It's really kind of her trademark. I don't know where they got this red aesthetic from her when they were making this show, because that, to my knowledge, never existed in the comics. In the comics, her aesthetic isn't red, it's flowers. And I frankly think it's annoying that they dress her in red 24/7, especially since she looks so great in other colors. And now her storylines. I promise this is gonna be quick. But Cheryl's storylines, in a nutshell, have been now, provided that Cheryl would be more than a one-dimensional mean girl, she deserves some better storylines, better than hiding the corpse of her brother in her basement, trying to vanquish a creepy doll that she thinks is the reincarnation of her triplet, being an obsessive predator to Josie, being totally fine with joining a cult that happens to be stationed in the same building in which she had her conversion therapy. How, in what world would someone be okay with that? No! Season 4, I'm gonna say, was a particularly bad season for Cheryl.
Jason's ghost. I think he's mad at us for what you made me do.
So, now that the doll's back,
The spirit of Julian
is haunting Thistle House?
What other explanation could there possibly be?
Awaken! Fact, evil spirits can't cross a circle of salt. It's a barrier against all forms of malevolence. All is right in the world. Isn't it? Yep.
Run, Tony! Run! Save yourself! She's not worth it! Oh my gosh. And don't even get me started on how she locked Miss Appleyard in her office until she apparently had a panic attack and lifted up her skirt during a cheerleading routine. Cheryl lifts up her skirt and like shakes her hips during a cheerleading routine in front of bleachers full of people. Cheryl lifted up her skirt during Cherry Bomb. Lifting up your skirt during a cheerleading routine lifts up her skirt. I've actually already talked about that a good few times. This just goes to show again how Cheryl's character has just gotten worse and worse and worse progressively since season 1, and it's really, really a shame. Now, if we're talking about the first version of Cheryl that I talked about, I don't think that she would be somebody who has a lot of friends, because I think that most people would hate her. But a couple of options for friends that I think she might have would be Ginger Lopez, who was initially brought into the Archie Comics cast as a replacement for Cheryl's character, because the creators of the Archie Comics, or not the creators, because the writers of the Archie Comics at that time didn't think that Cheryl was popular enough to keep as a character, but after some negative reviews by the readers, they brought Cheryl's character back and made Ginger her own character. Ginger is, again, somebody who is in and out of the Archie Comics. She spends half of her time in Riverdale, the other half, I think, in New York, if I'm remembering correctly. So them both being recurring characters in the comics, if they were both recurring characters in the show, I think that they would be friends. Another option for a friend of Mean Girl Cheryl would be Cedric, who was Jason's best friend in the comics. Just like Jason, he's very conniving, very scheming, and his personality matches that of Cheryl and Jason a lot. So I think that they would agree on a lot of things and manipulate and plan different schemes to antagonize Archie and friends together. There was also a hot minute in the comics where Cheryl was very close friends with Betty Cooper, but that whole thing stemmed from a feud between Betty and Veronica, and Cheryl kind of swooped in to spite Veronica and to make her jealous. And Betty went with it to get Veronica to apologize. But that was short-lived. Betty and Cheryl aren't portrayed as friends that often, but certainly more often than Cheryl and Veronica. Now this is going to be interesting because I do actually rather like in the show that Cheryl comes out as a lesbian, so I'm going to keep that canonical for this hypothetical version of her that I'm envisioning for this video. So this is going to be interesting because I will be looking at love interests for her that are before and after she comes out. In the comics, Cheryl's romances are a lot of what drives her storylines, both in the Archie series and in her own. In fact, one of the most quintessential Cheryl Blossom issues of all time is one in which Cheryl appeared on a dating show. In a reader poll event, Archie Comics finally gave Cheryl a new boyfriend, with readers voting on the potential boyfriends featured on the show. Blonde-haired fitness guru Austin, dark-complected computer genius Brandon, and shaved-head gourmet chef George. The winner of the contest was George. In another issue, a boy named Paris fell in love with her and they ended up getting married. They had 5 kids and 3 dogs named Carlotta, Penta, and Finn. Now, those characters are all quite irrelevant in the main scheme of things, so I'm not gonna talk about George, Austin, Paris, or Brandon because,
Like I said, they're quite irrelevant.
but starting with the love interests before she comes out, the first one I'm going to talk about is Archie Andrews. Now, like I said, Cheryl was originally brought in as a third love interest for Archie and does often win Archie over when she tries to pry him away from Betty and Veronica. Now, if this were to happen earlier in the show, I would appreciate it. Now, as we know, in seasons 1 and 2, Cheryl is still coming to terms with her sexuality and dealing with a lot of internalized homophobia. I think a good way to have showcased her hiding her sexuality in that first season and a half would be her trying to pry Archie away from Veronica. Because like I said in my Veronica video, I would want Archie and Veronica to be an item for more or less the first 2 seasons. If Cheryl were to do this, it would also further establish the rivalry between Cheryl and Veronica that we all know exists. And her coming out later would still make sense because throughout the whole thing, it would be clear to the viewer that Cheryl's not doing it because she's after Archie, she'd be doing it to get under Veronica's skin. Like, imagine Cheryl having a casual conversation with Archie and saying something like, "I don't know what you see in her, I'm so much better." And like I said in my Veronica video, I would want Veronica and Archie to be on and off for those first couple of seasons. So imagine if Archie and Veronica are taking a break or something and then Veronica is at her locker and she turns around and sees Archie and Cheryl walking down the hall and Cheryl is like holding Archie's arm and they pass Veronica and Cheryl smirks at her or something. I think that that would be some really great fun drama in the show. It would be a part of Cheryl's journey of self-discovery, and it would also pay homage to what often happened in the comics. The next love interest I'm going to talk about is Reggie Mantle. Now, at one point in the comics, Reggie and Cheryl started dating because they both had devilish minds that were very alike. Needless to say, their relationship was unsuccessful. I mean, yeah, if these two were to date in the show, of course it would be before she comes out and it would be a hot mess. Okay, the last male love interest I'm going to talk about, I don't know if you're expecting him, but it's Dilton Doily. Now, no matter how unlikely it may seem, Cheryl and Dilton are actually a thing in the comics. In the late 1990s, Cheryl began dating Dilton. They were paired together online without knowing each other's true identity, fell in love, met in real life, and decided to continue their romantic relationship, though it was largely ignored in later stories. I know that one sounds weird, but it was actually a thing, and if you look on Wikipedia, Dilton is still considered one of Cheryl's main love interests. Now, after she comes out, I have 2 people who I would want to see her with, and if you've seen any of my other videos, even if you haven't, I'm sure you can guess who these two people are. The first one we're going to talk about is Tony. Now, Cheryl and Tony had so much potential in this show, and it is completely ruined now.
All is right in the world, isn't it?
My love.
Yep.
So Cheryl and Tony were to date in the show. If the show had played their cards correctly, they would be more equal and their personalities would remain constant and complement each other, and they wouldn't be defined by their relationship. Like, they would still be their own people and do other things like a normal relationship. Because in the show now, I feel like Cheryl and Tony's relationship is very codependent.
Besides seeing her backstory of the family, I would love to see her still being the strong, confident, independent girl that she was when you met her in season 2. You know, she didn't take BS from anybody.
Since Tony's gotten with Cheryl, she's been completely stripped of her personality, and this relationship at this point is so far from equal that it has become problematic. Cheryl is the only person that Tony talks to. She's the only person that Tony has any interaction or storylines with. Tony adjusts to Cheryl's every move and agrees with Cheryl on everything, even when Cheryl is wrong. And her only sense of identity now is Cheryl's girlfriend. That's it. Cheryl and Tony would have worked so well if Tony's personality had stuck around and they had complemented each other. But instead, this is what we got. I also wouldn't have them living together. I just think for a high school relationship, I just think it's too soon. And obviously them living together is part of the reason why Tony totally has lost all of her identity, because she literally has no space from Cheryl and she doesn't spend time with any of her old friends anymore. Which is also something so important. I would love to see Cheryl and Tony spend time with other people, because friendships and rivalries are also important things to write and take note of in a show like this. So unless Tony finds her own identity again, or some way to be not just Cheryl's sidekick, I do not support this ship anymore. But if she does, yeah, sure. I'd be fine with them ending up together then. Now, the other love interest that I would love to see for Cheryl is Veronica. Now, I've said this before, but Cheryl and Veronica's rivalry in the comics, I think, would make for a very interesting ship in this new imagining of this world, in this show. They would be one of those television couples that start out kind of hating each other and fighting all the time, and they get like really like close to each other when they do fight, and you always think they're gonna kiss, but they never do until the one time when they actually do. And after it happens, they would be really taken aback and confused by it, and confused about where they stand and what they want, and you know what it means to have those feelings for somebody that you thought that you hated. I just think that that would have been so interesting and so much fun to watch play out. And I think that if they were together, it would have a lot of that passion and spark. And as they both mature as people throughout the series, maybe they would figure out how to be a more functional couple. Cheryl and Veronica are interesting in the respect that they are very similar, but they're also very different. I think at this point we all know ways in which they're very similar. They both have similar wealthy upbringings. They both butt heads with each other because they think that they lead the more extravagant lifestyle. But as of differences, Veronica is much more warm-hearted and helpful to people in need than Cheryl. Cheryl is much more manipulative and conniving than Veronica. And I think that this mixture of similarities and differences that have always existed in the comics would lay a good groundwork and foundation for maybe something more in the show. Cheryl. Now this character obviously hasn't lasted as long as Archie, Betty, Veronica, Jughead, or Reggie, and she is not in the comics nearly as much as those characters, but she still has, you know, made an appearance in an abundance of comics, different versions of comics. So if you have any other questions about Cheryl Blossom, her character, her friendships, her rivalries, her love interests, her storylines, what else that I might want to see from her in this failed attempt at an Archie Comics reincarnation, leave them down in the comments. I would be more than happy to answer those. And if you don't feel like asking any questions, or if you can't think of any, instead you can comment down below something that you would have liked to see from Cheryl's character. Like I said, I described 2 different versions of her that I would have been totally down with, because having a horrible person doing horrible, unjustified things in a setting in which you are supposed to root for them is problematic and wrong and has gotten extremely annoying. So of course I had to separate it into 2 options. But let me know if you have any other thoughts, and let me know which Archie Comics character you would like me to analyze next. In the near future, I'm looking at Archie, Jughead, Reggie, and Kevin. So stay tuned for those. As always, thank you ever so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video and would like to see more videos like this, please do not forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel, and as always, have a wonderful, amazing day. Bye!
TEETEE, awaken!